Welcome to the Dream Together podcast. My name is Clarence Hill, and we're so excited to be here with you. We're going to jump into 3 episodes, and we're going to focus on the church and the city. This is going to be a topic for everybody. I've personally seen so many situations where the faith community is stepping up to make a difference. And anyone who has already given their lives to Christ and says, hey, I'm a part of the church, we think about how can we make a difference? I don't know where you land on that, but making a difference in your city, stepping up to meet need and human suffering, it can be difficult. So we want to talk about the challenges on both sides. And we really want to talk about some very practical things that these practitioners and these leaders with lived experience can really pour into when it comes to successfully working together with the city, when it comes to keeping a family healthy in the process. We're going to cover 3 topics: family, leadership, and finances. Let's get started. Let's make some intros. It's been a while. Let's talk a little bit. So I have Scotia Moore, mom of 10, husband of the mighty man that everybody thinks is me sometimes walking around.
He's my husband.
That's right. That's right. And he is brave. This man leads a mighty ministry. You guys lead Shiloh Camp, and you do wonderful things for kids who probably wouldn't get that experience. How's your world?
My world is, I'm a mom of 10, so right. It's always a tornado. But, and I was telling Lee earlier, I'm nothing if not finding peace in the midst of very things that are pulling in multiple directions. So there's grief and there's celebration and there's hard stuff and there's just things we're skating through and having fun. So, my world is multifaceted.
And
I'll
then,
say that.
Yeah, and then you put your superhero robe on and you come all the way down here.
It's more like a tattered, raggedy, holes in it robe. But.
Yeah, and you're homeschooling, but yet you're here. You're always involved in what's going on in the city. So we've got a lot to talk about because we want to make a difference, but we got to serve our families too.
Yeah.
All right, Lee Rowland's in the house too. Lee, have you been busy or just been sitting around?
I hope you've been sitting around.
That's right.
That sounds nice. I've had less opportunity to play golf than ever, which I love to do. But no, I've been busy preaching, trying to speak into some solutions that our city is plagued with, as well as trying to run my business, Voyage Consulting, which is around these kinds of issues: leadership, family, our children and their needs, particularly in our schools. How do we address the racial divide in the actual workspace? What to do, and in a way that doesn't make anybody feel shamed or guilty. We want to make sure that we just have an workplace, a shop place that everybody feels safe and just feels like they are contributing to some common good in that space.
Yep, you did it at Two Lakes. I saw it, and a group of us saw it, and there were some leaders in tears when they saw this cross-cultural relationship and the hope that was locked in at Two Lakes Elementary. So get your book, Fantastic Voyage. Dr. John Mark Hart, you're all over the place. How's your world?
I resonated with what you were saying, Scotia. Peace sometimes in the midst of the storm.
Yeah.
But lots of opportunities in the world. I love my wife. I love my kids. I love my church, and lots of opportunities to serve in the city. And I'm having fun with all of it. And sometimes it feels like you're pulled in a lot of different directions, but trying to stay centered and have peace and have joy on the journey.
Yeah. Let's jump in. We've gone through a season where I think people are very aware that there have been a lot of people disgruntled with the church, with the body of Christ. I've heard a lot of people say, well, the church is irrelevant in a lot of ways. I think my perspective is very different because I'm like very boots on the ground, and I see the body of Christ very, very passionate about human suffering in a city. Even if they're not a part of an organization, I've really seen a lot. So I would love to hear what you all think when I say, what is the church's role in a city? Because I've seen both sides. I see that sometimes we go after hard things, but it's like you go after hard things, and what we're going to talk about today a lot is family. You still have a family to care for also, but yet you're driving past lots of need, the unhoused, the trafficking reports, etc. That's how my mind thinks. So I just want to throw this out here. When someone says there's a church in my city or there's a church in my community, what first comes to mind when you're like, I'm going to join the church in my city? What should be someone's expectations? Who wants to jump in first?
Well, I'll say a few things. First of all, you mentioned people who feel disgruntled or feel hurt by the church. And as a pastor, I always feel it would be responsible to acknowledge first that some people are frustrated and hurt for legitimate reasons. Some people have really experienced abuse and pain and a lot of hard things in the church. And as we talk about the church, sometimes the community of Jesus doesn't act like Jesus. And Jesus told us that was going to happen. And we should have so much patience and compassion and love for people who have been hurt in that environment. But at the same time, the picture is complicated, and there's all sorts of God's people doing beautiful things all the time in the community. And when I begin to think about the role of the church in the city or in the world, one thing that I think is helpful to do, theologians sometimes talk about thinking about the mission of the church. What are we supposed to do? Shouldn't really start with the church. We should start by talking about the mission of God, the Missio Dei. And then we can look at Scripture and see all sorts of passages like the prophet Isaiah talking about a world filled with the glory of God that's marked by peace and justice, where children can play in safety and where people aren't living under the fear of death. Or we could look at the Apostle Paul talking about the peace that Jesus brought by his cross and how he's going to reconcile all things so that there's healing and grace in the world. We can look at the last couple chapters of the Bible, a new heavens and new earth marked by peace, in which every human being can flourish, in which communities are thriving and nobody's left out. And we get a picture of God has a mission to bring healing to the world in a very holistic way. That's about restoring our relationship with himself, teaching us how to love one another, creating an opportunity for everyone whom he's created in his image to thrive and reach their full God-given potential and contribute to the world. And so the mission of the church then is to participate with God in his mission. So that involves sharing the good news of Jesus. It involves mentoring people. It involves trying to make sure everybody gets a great education. It involves stewarding ecological resources in God's world. It involves trying to seek just structures for societies so that everybody is honored and nobody's oppressed. It involves all of that as God's people are saying, Lord, what's on your heart and how can we join you in that work? That's what we're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. And whenever I see church being healthy, that's what we're after.
I love how eloquent John states that. My mind, my brain is just tumbling and it's all jumbled up, and I think it'll come out in my words perhaps. But as I think of these two words, propensity and proclivity is the tendency, the negative tendency. Propensity is kind of in a positive light. And so I think the proclivity, the negative, is for the church in general. If an alien comes to the world, Oklahoma, he sees a church that has a propensity to worship, to sing and preach and gather there. Where I'd like to see that propensity is that we are going out. And it's not surprising that we get that response from you, because that's what you guys do at your church. And that's what's in your heart. I'd like to see that be more of the norm and less of the unusual, but I think what we should be seeing in the church is a true sense, and this is broad, and I like that because the listener can determine for themselves. But for we see a church that is selfless, it is godly and selfless. So what we're meeting and assembling at this church is not about me. It's not about us. It's about God, and therefore it's about them. I didn't think about it until right now, but when we did that as a school, we took off. We started sailing when we started to look less at ourselves and say, Mommy, send me a child that is behaving right, behaving well, hungry, eager to learn, doing everything that I ask them to do. You come to school and approach me in that way. When we started to be more selfless, our school started to cruise. It started to sail. And I think we'd see the same thing, that alien would see the same thing in Oklahoma and America if we saw more of the norm, the church being selfless. Now, let me say this, lest anyone think I'm pointing a finger, because I don't mean to do that. Church work, school work, all this work is hard. It is difficult. And there's no manual, do these 10 things as a pastor, as a church, do these, and you have met the expectations. So it's a lot of interpretations, a lot of people that we have to respond to, from the banker to the houseless family. There's so many things they have to do. I don't mean to suggest that this is easy, and I certainly don't want to point a finger. I'm part of the problem and or the solution. I want to be a part of the solution to where that alien comes and says, wow, look at what those people right there are doing.
Mm-hmm. I didn't grow up with the context of church. So I didn't grow up with faith as a central part of my upbringing. We didn't go to church. I didn't read a Bible. I'm not from the Bible Belt. So it was not, my understanding of the church came as I came into faith. And so as almost an adult, I was a late teenager. And so for me, it has been, when I try to wrap my mind around the identity of the church, like the role of the church, et cetera, I've never, probably because I had traveled a bunch as a teenager, and I always have like this global, holistic, integrated kind of perspective that's not segmented into this is church life and this is work and this is family. Like it's just all one ball and it's all mixed up together, and not even like a salad where you can pick out, oh, this is a tomato. It's like a cake where it's all, wrapped together and mixed together and baked together. But, and so for me, the church, is about first the identity of being related to God, as you mentioned, and then also like loving Him with all of our heart, all of our being, everything that's in us, and then loving our neighbor. So it's not that one specifically, First Baptist, First Methodist. It's never been about that. I've never been able to like grab hold of all of those things, just that it was the people that are following Jesus and loving Him and trying to love our neighbor like we love ourselves.
Sure.
So it's not about, although I know that there are specific fellowships that are represented within this overall thing that is called the church, I don't necessarily look at it only as that. And so it's not church work over here. It's like the church at work, everywhere, on the job, in the family, at the grocery store, et cetera. So, and that is just trying to follow the ways of Jesus.
Yes, I agree.
Can I add this, lest I don't get an opportunity to say it later in another question, but I don't know who's credited at asking this question. I don't know who is, but the question has been asked. All of us have heard it. If this church was gone, that church was gone, would it be missed?
That's what we're leaning towards.
And I think that question ought to be at the heart of every church leader, every church congregation. Would we be missed? Are we just assembling and having fun ourselves, really growing ourselves and immersing ourselves? Or would we be missed by the people around us? And if we can't say unequivocally, yes, we need to pump the brakes. One of the things, and again, I won't keep doing this, it just happens to be an application. What I would do sometimes at a staff meeting, many of my staff, most of my staff had a child at the school.
As principal.
As a principal. And so I'd grab one of those rascals running down the hall, put him in a chair, and set the chair on the table. Okay, it was a liability. The kid could fall if he got too squirmy. So I would make sure I didn't get, a kid like me. Get a kid that could sit there for 30 minutes, and I'd ask the staff as we're answering these questions. Is your answer about that child? Mm-hmm. Is it about? And if it doesn't address the needs and serving this child, is it part of something that we need to have as a priority? Mm-hmm. Okay, and so this child needs to be safe. They need to learn. We need to make sure that they can enter the building, have recess, have lunch. I hated for a child to tell me by the time I got to lunch, I had 5 minutes to eat. Okay, well, there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with that. Everybody doesn't throw food down like I do. It's got to be about them. So would we be missed? Would our school be missed if we weren't there? Would our church be? But especially our church.
Yeah, this is a great question, I think, for all of us. How are you personally touching someone else's life? So if we're part of that church in a community, part of that church in a city, I love how you just said, if that church were removed, is it just a gathering for that group? But I also want to say that I don't think we always measure it well. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, especially when we're scrutinizing the situation. So I want to bring in the topic of family. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on that. I think that's right, Clarence. And I think we can use that question as a helpful tool of self-critique.
Yes.
We should not be afraid of critiquing ourselves. If I read my Bible, God doesn't seem to be afraid of critiquing his people, right, when we're not doing what he told us to do.
That's for sure.
But I think also sometimes we can get discouraged. And I was just thinking, I bet there's a lot of local churches that need It's a Wonderful Life moment. I'm thinking Jimmy Stewart, right? That movie people watch every Christmas. He's about to kill himself. He thinks my life hasn't made a difference. And then he gets the little vision, what the world would be like without him there. Mm-hmm. And he sees all the positive differences he has made in small ways. And I just thinking about the fact that, even when we're struggling and limping along and failing to be all that Jesus has called us to be, I know it's a reality in my neighborhood that has a lot of pain that, as I talk to people so often, it's like the points of hope and healing in their lives. Well, I went to this clinic. Well, I know that some Christians from this church down the street started that clinic. And then I had this one teacher who made a difference in my life. And I happen to know that that teacher is a believer who herself almost gave up 5 times, but her pastor encouraged her and she stayed in there and then encouraged this kid. And on, that we can see the difference. And sometimes maybe we can't measure it. Sometimes maybe it's not about quantitative analyses, but it's about stories of what's happening in people's lives that maybe we're making more of a difference than we know. But sorry if that sounds a little too Pollyanna and optimistic now.
That's not a maybe. That's not a maybe. I almost would want to take the rest of the podcast to zero in on this piece, and let's go through this piece just like we're going through a cave. Mm. That's a big deal, because not only are we wondering, hey, is our church doing anything in the city? But what are the statistics on pastors that quit through COVID? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the stress on a pastor and their family and the work, and that's just pastors. Now let's talk about nonprofits, and let's talk about some of us renegades who just run all over the place all day long, trying to make as much of a difference as possible, that's heavy. And the level of discouragement to me is off the charts.
Yeah, I'm seeing that.
And who catches that discouragement? This is what I believe. It's the individual that's dreaming. Someone's trying to make a difference, and their own mental calculator says, what am I doing?
So I don't want to be too loquacious, but I do want to jump in there in response to what John Mark's comment and to yours. I think, and I want to be very, very clear on this, I don't want the church measuring itself necessarily on metrics.
Sure.
Back to school, I don't want to just measure kids on metrics and test scores. So one of the things that we did in school is your child could qualify as gifted and not pass a math test, okay? And so there are lots of measurements to determine whether or not a church is doing something meaningful and whatnot and being relevant. And I think you did say it. Sometimes it's anecdotally. Back to the nonprofits, if you're going to measure me on how many these things happen or whatever, we may not meet that. Right. But if you ask that mother that you just talked about that came to church and you were leaving and said, hey, can you give me $5? You reached in her pocket. She's going to miss you if you're gone. Right. When there's no one anecdotally, no one's testimony that says not one person around that church can say my life has been touched by that church. Again, I'm not saying the church is not doing God's work. I'm saying they need to pump the brakes and ask themselves, put that chair back on the table and say, does it matter to that person? So school, are we helping this child? Community, are we helping you in some way? We may not be feeding 50 people. We may not be giving away Christmas toys, but are we doing something? And if we're not doing anything, I want to use a double negative. If we ain't doing nothing, then that's a problem.
But Lee, for me, when you say that, I'm not saying either or.
I didn't hear that.
This is so much of both and. Yeah. And when you made the statement, if I take, should I say rapture the church out?
Yes, that's fine.
When we rapture the church folks out, there is a point that does have some validity. That what if the church is so focused on something and they're not making a great impact? There is something to ask yourself. Yeah. But I also think that, man, there are some, maybe we're measuring ourselves with too big of a stick and we need to go down and remember centimeters and millimeters. What does it mean for me to run into Stephen and Scotia in the hallway? What does it mean for me to be in a space together where we're saying, hey, we're gonna do something with our lives outside of ourselves? Just maybe that one, if that's the aim. But I think you're right. Perhaps there are church spaces where there is no focus on what John Mark introduced. We started at 30,000 feet on this conversation to say, what was God's plan for planting his desires and thoughts in a people in the earth? Okay, I want to tie this into family because that's going to help us drive this to some very practical deals that I believe that everybody can begin to think through. Something, my week mattered this week. Maybe I haven't solved how to get all of the unhoused into homes in my city. But, boy, I still need to make sure I value what I can do enough, because if I don't do that, someone needs me and they're not hearing from me. I only called one other person. Yeah, you might have been pouring into someone when your marriage was going through a big crisis. Perhaps you were pouring into someone and you gave them finances when you were low on finances. So I want to bring in this subject of family. We are coming out of family fragmentation, fatherlessness, so that when an individual or a family comes into our churches, I'm a senior pastor also, the situations that people are in the middle of, they don't always heal right away. Mm-hmm. Mine didn't heal. There are still areas where my family, and I'm a second generation believer, where Alicia and I, that's my wife and I, we are still building, working towards wholeness. And I've been in the ministry for 30 years, and we are still, but the gathering of those who are following Jesus, we are getting stronger. But there's an aspect of saying, hey, our church is to impact the city. But what do we do with the level of brokenness in families? What can you say to individuals when they're like, my marriage is falling apart, I must have failed as a parent because half my children or one of my children doesn't want to talk to me, or they don't want to serve God anymore. And the list goes on. What do you do with that pain? Help me out, you all, because I know this is broad, but we can talk about that individual, and we can talk about those of us who serve. And what we've learned in the Stronger Together movement is we don't always start our meetings with business. Mm-hmm. We have to make space with how are you so we can all finish long term. Yeah. Because usually the ones that are out there trying to make a difference, no one's checking on us. Pick any topic, friends. Mm-hmm. I want this to be rubber meets the road. We've kind of been up here a little bit talking about, but we all live in spaces where the brokenness of family has affected us all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I come to that with first saying what you don't do. And what you don't do is try to tuck that behind you and keep running on brokenness. And so I'm one of those people who feel like you need to courageously take a good, honest look at the pain. And so if it's internal, like within a person's own heart, because, the scars that we get in our homes and our family context, those are the ones that are the deepest and take the longest to heal. True. Because we care so much and because it's formative, and what the home can be, the fullness of what the home can be, we won't ever fully achieve on earth because we're all messed up.
I think if I could just put that in a little book right there.
The book that I will probably never get to write.
No, someone helped Scotia write this book. But what you said was it'll never be achieved on earth. And I think there's a hunger in us all to come home, whether you're the husband or the wife or the child, and there's just like prime time in Colorado, everybody's cheering for you and they got your shades on. Yeah. Right. And you are the spotlight. And what did you do today? And how hard was it? And what was the solution that you got? Yeah. Everybody wants that walking in the door.
Yeah. No. I mean, I've been a parent of 6 teenagers at the same time. And that spotlight is more like you're trying to sneak around the corner in the dark, and then the spotlight shines on you. And all of your warts and pimples and problems are magnified. Yep. So, I mean, I think one is acknowledging that perfection is not going to happen here. And so starting from a place of redemption, restoration, moving toward wholeness, moving toward healing, it might not happen. I haven't found, someone else may have found. There's no magic bullet or there's not the one solution, the one key that will turn the lock and solve it all, and everything will be great from here on. Mm-hmm. It's a walk of endurance, and it's not just a walk of endurance for one lifetime. It's a walk of endurance and healing and restoration to wholeness over generations. It took all these generations to get as messed up as we are, and it will take plenty of generations to move forward. But there is grace for that. There is provision for that. And so just being able to continue to move forward and figure out how do we move forward in this together as a family. And you talked about just that fatigue factor. And I think that is, and people needing to hear encouragement and them needing support. And if we have a chance to look up from our own pain and just look over and say, and pray for, or send a word of encouragement or a text, it means so much to people. So
if I could tell anybody anything, if you have the slightest thought to call and check on someone, call. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you thought to hug somebody instead of just doing a nod, or if you were like, hey, I'm going to call them afterwards, something seemed off.
Yeah.
Check on them. And because I just like the fact you said, just keep moving the ball forward because it matters. I think, John Mark, you look like you were getting ready to jump into on this convo.
Well, I love everything that you guys have been saying. And as we think about the power of family, I think about one of our shared friend, mentor heroes, John Perkins, saying, the family is the institution of love.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you experience love. That's where you learn how to love.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that from a place of acknowledging both the power for good and the power for destruction. When family goes wrong, then people end up not feeling loved, and so they trying to find self-worth acting out in all kinds of destructive ways. But when family goes right, that creates the soil in which people can really grow and thrive. And so then how do we think about that in relation to all the discouraging statistics that you referenced and the realities of generational pain that Scotia was talking about? And, if we had unlimited time, I would want to do a little Bible study and think through the stories of that family in Genesis, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and then that fourth generation. God said he wanted to work through that family to create a people who practice righteousness and justice in the earth. But there's so much generational pain that gets passed down on that family, and there's so much generational blessing that gets passed down on that family, and the two are really fighting it out in a way that comes to fruition in the fourth generation. But as I think about that with what we're dealing with every day, I just think, my family, we love each other. By God's grace, my kids have a lot of things in their lives that make them statistically likely to be able to make it in life. But I know there have been a lot of times where we probably wouldn't have held it together if it wasn't for people helping us in a lot of different ways, a wider community, providing free babysitting for us, so letting it say, hey, you take some time off. We're going to cover your responsibility so you can rest and recover together. Older mentors speaking words of a lot of encouragement and the occasional gentle correction, to Candace and I as parents and as a married couple. And in my church, I just recognize we're dealing with those realities despite the fact that Candace and I were both blessed to be nurtured within very loving, stable homes. And 80-something% of the people and adults in my church who are trying to have families are coming from one or both partners, came from homes that were very not healthy and not thriving, and sometimes abusive, and sometimes, just a lot of trauma, fatherlessness that's generational. So sometimes, given just the generational momentum, it takes a heroic effort for people just to hold it together this week and keep loving their kids and keep paying the mortgage or the rent. And so sometimes the church, as a little bit wider community of love, then has the opportunity in really small ways to make that phone call, how are you doing? To say, hey, why don't you drop the kids off so y'all can go out on a date night for the first time in 3 months? Or to say, hey, tell me what's going on so I can pray with you. A lot of times people don't need advice, they just need help. Sometimes we need advice, but we just need a little help and a little encouragement, and to help people, because if we can turn the momentum in those families so that the generational momentum isn't pulling us out into chaos, but it's pulling us into peace, then over the long haul, if you take the 1 century view or the 2 century view, that's one of the biggest things we can do to bring healing in all these broader societal issues.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to set this up so that someone can kind of grab some really, really healthy advice, from 4 people who are practitioners who have faced a lot of difficult challenges. We don't always have spaces, and I don't think it's right to be too transparent, because we used to always tell the couples in our marriage ministries, like, hey, you be as transparent as your spouse is comfortable with. All right. I know you, because you'd have one spouse just sitting there like, when we get home, we're going to talk about you and your freedom to say whatever you want to say in the couples meeting. So there's a healthy transparency that I think we can give some great advice. Let's say I am between the age of like 20 and 25, and I want to make a difference. I see the challenges in the world. So I'm going to go serve. I'm going to join a ministry. Maybe I have a full-time job during the day. We're looking at brokenness in family. What are some things that we can speak to? Let's start with the young man. What can we say to this young man who wants to make a difference? They're full of zeal. They want to make a change in the world, just as, maybe some older voices. What kind of advice would you give them?
Is this young guy married? Does he have a family?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Single young man. Then we'll do a single young lady afterwards. What are we sharing with that young man? And they're perhaps looking.
I've got 2 that just come to my mind. First off, for the male and the female, that being finding what young people use to communicate, which is largely technology or social media, and finding positive ways to speak into that space. There's way too much noise and negative stuff and divisive kinds of things and joking and whatnot. But if I'm telling young people every day, use your voice, because your voice actually is listened to. Some of the older people just immediately plug their ears to them and they think they have an axe to grind. But when your innocence speaks into that space, it does fill a void. It is heard. So I think finding TikTok, Instagram, different things, and so you're coming on saying something positive when most people your age are not. They're talking about this concert, this person. I just found out University of Oklahoma, I think, has a Swiftie class or whatever. So, they're talking about Taylor Swift. I mean, a class that actually talks about her influence. Go Taylor, good, congratulations. But
You've made it.
You've made it. But young people speaking into space where there are problems in the world that they're going on, saying something positive, coming to hear Pastor Clarence, Pastor John Mark, maybe getting some advice from them, some counsel, just listening to Sunday's message and going out and saying that. I think there's one way that they could get involved and make a difference. The second one is a little bit controversial, and I don't mean for it to be, but I think leaders need to hear from young people. And I've always encouraged people to share with the leader your thoughts. So we're told, call your congressman, email your congressman and tell them your thoughts and whatnot, because without your thought, without your input, they'll just go off on their own. And they've solicited, hey, contact me, let me know. Well, I think these young people, this 20-something-year-old needs to tell the pastor, this is ways that you could help me and help my peers. Without them telling us, we don't know. Now, there may be some times we have to push back on that, but it will still benefit Pastor John, Pastor any pastor. It would still benefit him to know how they're thinking, so that you could preach and so that you could teach and address issues. Because just frankly, when I hate to keep mentioning it, but as an administrator, I would tell my teachers, if you're over 20, you're old as dirt. You're old as dirt, because time has exponentially sped up. And so we're just clueless. I mean, I couldn't believe some of the issues that young people were dealing with that was totally beyond our conceivability. I had a very young child that, I don't know if you could call him an alcoholic or not, but drank every day. Mom leaves and whatever. Those weren't issues. And so we couldn't even conceive of having students that were drinking and involved in other areas. So if they come, let us know. I think some preaching, some teaching, some studies, some gatherings, this would help us, because life is hard.
Yeah. So intergenerational dialogue, I think, is rich. And like you're saying, it works both ways. Because when I'm thinking about this topic, I'm like, okay, you just told a young man to find an adult that listens. So I think that's very, very important. I would tell you, part of my confidence was my dad, who is my mentor. He was so strong in the grace that was on his life and in the gifting that was on his life that I was shocked that he wanted to know my opinion on things. And just the fact that he would listen was great. So you, as like our lead educator at the table, I think that's a great point. But to also tell the young people who grew up in homes, back to family, that's kind of how I'm trying to frame this question here. Mm-hmm. A lot of times when we want to change the world, we want to go straight out because the problem's out there. And sometimes we've lost the value of go out. But one of the greatest things you can do in going out is picking the right spouse, having intergenerational relationships as you find that spouse. So I'm seeing a lot of other benefits to having a healthy relationship where there's exchange, where they're pouring into you and you're open enough to communicate. I love running into young people, and especially children, who speak with their eyes and they shake hands and they talk confidently to me. I'm like, way to go, parents. Stop letting that head drop and be locked into video games, and they can only comfortable communicating with peers. So I think that's a great point. Family fragmentation. There's a young man standing there, and now let's, like Lee said, let's do both genders. Young man, young woman, their early 20s. The world is before them. They want to make a difference. What advice do you give them in the context of family is hard right now?
This one's just real super practical, is learning to mitigate loneliness.
That's great.
Because loneliness, or the fear of it, or the avoidance of it, drives a lot of young people into things that are creating more wounds and more pain and more brokenness. And so learning to mitigate loneliness with, some very practical things like having a mentoring relationship where you have someone who knows all your junk and all your victories and knows you well enough to speak to you things that you can't see about yourself.
Good.
And also, building some relationships that are deeper than the surface, that are horizontal with peers. But also, ultimately, there's no human relationship that can fully fill us. And so the reality of that, coming into the reality of that helps us to dig into that relationship with God, which is where we find purpose, what we're made to do, who we are, identity, all of those things. And so just very practically, like when I'm talking to, because I have 4 children in that age range, and they're spread out across the country, and they have had to deal with being the only for whatever reason, whether it's their faith or their race or whatever, whatever. But also just new to a region of the country. Like, how do you handle loneliness? What does it cause you to do? How do you try to anesthetize that with entertainment or busyness or whatever? So that would be a very practical one that I would say to a young person, like, how are you going to manage this part right here? And then the other piece, I think it goes back to identity. Like, who are you and what were you created to do when you're wanting to make a difference? There are a million ways to do that. So what is your piece? Because you can't carry everybody's piece. It'll drive you crazy. So what is your piece? And that is directly related to how you're made and who you're created to be. So those would be two.
And that does go back to the mentoring relationship too, because it's one thing to interpret yourself in the mirror.
Right.
But
it's a dangerous thing.
Yeah, that can be very,
age.
very dangerous. John Mark, were you going to jump in there?
I would love to. And what's amazing is I was thinking through three things over here, what I should say, and Scotia just said two of them. But I think the thing I would start with anybody in that life stage is the issue of identity. If our identity isn't grounded in something transcendent and infinite, then we're going to try and find an identity in something finite, which won't work. And we're going to be exhausting ourselves and worrying ourselves and chasing the wind. And so what I mean here is you're loved by God. You're created by God. You have a purpose by God. That is secure. That's who you are. And particularly if you're coming out of a broken family, that might be really hard to believe. But it's true. And you can chase identity through, I'm going to make a positive difference in the world and then I'll have a meaningful life. And that won't work. It'll be exhausting, actually. You can chase it through, I'm going to find that perfect spouse. And then we're going to have a great marriage and that's going to give me identity. And that won't work either. I mean, good grief, whoever thinks their spouse is going to satisfy their deepest needs in life is set up to be disappointed and to be angry probably at this person for being inadequate, So there's something that's really core about spiritual formation of like, I've got to know that I'm created and loved by God, or else I'm not going to be able to have the resources within me to love anybody well, to have healthy friendships, to have healthy relationships, or to serve. That from that place of being loved not for what I do, that's where I get the wherewithal to do something meaningful in the world. I think that ties into the issue of loneliness that you mentioned. That the Surgeon General of the United States a few months ago released a statement saying that the next epidemic in America is loneliness, and that there's all this data in that report that he shared saying we can show that loneliness causes physical health issues equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. He went through all this different data, and when he talked about the mental health crises, the physical health crises, that are tied to loneliness, and started giving a diagnosis. The Surgeon General of the United States, he talked about social media, of course, which Lee has alerted us to, talked about family breakdown. But one of the things he said is people stopped going to houses of worship. They stopped going to church and synagogue and mosque. And that was already a trend in America prior to the pandemic. And then a lot of people didn't go back after the pandemic. And that is exacerbating a really serious public health crisis because that's where so many people found community. So I think that is a crucial issue. Learning again how to live in loving, authentic relationships where we're really known and where we stick with people in real life, embodied community over time, where we can find healing. And last thing I would just say, and I'll be real brief, is find a place to serve. If you want to change the world, find a place to serve. And very often we're taught to find your place of influence, find your place of power, and then from that place of influence and power, then you'll be able to make a difference. And I would just say, find a way to serve. Find a way to serve the most vulnerable. And if you do that, then you'll find redemptive influence will be the fruit of that.
We're going to keep this conversation going. We're going to talk about leadership in our next podcast because to me, the family and through serving, these are the ways that great leaders can be molded and raised up right there in the family unit. I also want to say that there's been several things that have been spoken so far already that were worth kind of taking 10 to 15 minutes to talk about each. Someone's going to serve, and you're going to go back to your apartment, or you're going to go back and maybe you have 2 or 3 roommates, and you're going to experience loneliness. And you're going to have to kick it into your spiritual cup, because something greater is going to have to keep you anchored. And I wanted this advice to be put out here because it's easier to live if you know that the obstacle course is harder now in this area, versus having soft expectations. Like John, John Mark, you just carefully mentioned this piece, but it was so true. I don't know if y'all heard it. If you're thinking, now that I'm married, I will never wrestle with going home and having someone to share my day with. Because now we've got to deal with the generational brokenness. And John Mark, you also mentioned that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, it's like you have to know that there was brokenness. And I think I want everybody to know this, to kind of land this piece. The brokenness did not stop the purpose and the blessing.
That's right.
That's right. Good.
The pain was there and it was real. We're talking step family issues. We're talking rape. We're talking murder. We're talking betrayal. We're talking lies. All of that was in those 4 generations: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the 12 brothers. All of that was in there. But yet the blessing, I mean, we sing about Father Abraham. We should be saying had many problems. Many problems had Father Abraham. But get somewhere and don't give up on people. Because sometimes the people that you feel failed you, they were reaching as far as they could.
Right.
Now, I think, and that's the wildest thing about this family piece here, is that I hear people saying, hey, the church hurt me. And I'm looking and I'm like, I know both sides of the story. And I'm like, oh my. If you only knew what your shepherd was going through. Oh my, if you only knew what your life group leader, your friends were going through. They needed you too.
It's a good word.
That's right.
It's a very good word.
Let's not quit. There's more to dig into, because we might as well say it. God is able to bring beauty from ashes.
Amen.
And he can literally bring this, and he just needs us to stay available. All right, thank you all for joining us here on the Dream Together podcast. Hey, call your friends or share this with friends and get the word out and let them know that there's a great conversation for those who want to change the world. We believe that God's dream for us is greater than our dream for ourselves, and we believe that if we trust him, he'll do greater things than we can imagine. Thanks, y'all.